Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final installment of the State Museum's 2020 Archaeology Workshops. I'm Beth Hager, Director of the Museum, which is a bureau of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission. And I just wanted to thank everyone for their participation at what we think has been a really successful and excellent series. I'd like to thank several folks for making this happen. Our Senior Curator of Archaeology, Dr. Carr, and his staff in the museum's archaeology section for curating the series. Education and Outreach Chief Jenny Ashton and Museum Educator Sherry Trimble, who produced the series. Exhibit staffer Alan Byler for technical support. And our nonprofit partner, the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation, for coordinating the registration and hosting the Zoom call. And of course, I'd also like to thank all of the four presenters that just have given excellent presentations, and no doubt this one will be so as well today. This is the first time that we've offered the workshops virtually, and we're thrilled with the turnout and the content and dialogue that's been generated. We'll be providing even more Pennsylvania-centered content in art, history, archaeology, and natural history in the coming months. And we'd like to invite you to join us for those sessions as well. The next online presentation will be Friday, November 20th at 12 noon, highlighting our juried Art of the State exhibition. So I know all of you have a passion for archaeology, but you might find something in our other talks that will be enjoyable as well, and that you would enjoy as well. The details will be on our website soon and on social media. We do remain closed to the public at least through the end of December and don't have a reopening date yet. So we'd like to ask that you please continue to follow us on social media and on our website for updates on our status as it becomes available. We do really look forward to seeing as many of you in person in 2021 at some point. So now I'd like to introduce Sherry Trimble to get today's program started. Sherry, thank you and congratulations on this series.
Thank you, Beth. So I just wanted to, Beth already mentioned it, but I wanted to once again thank the Pennsylvania Heritage Foundation for all their support for these programs. You know, they're really the ones that help us with your donations and other programs to be able to pull this off and get our programs going. And remember, this year again, it's been a wonderful series. We've been exploring the Delaware Indians then and now. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Carr, Senior Curator of Archaeology at the State Museum of Pennsylvania since 2007. Dr. Carr curates over 10 million artifacts. He and his staff actively excavate, publish, and present their blog, which, by the way, in the chat box, a couple people are asking about what Dr. Carr was chatting about at the beginning of the program. His blog does update all of that information about what his crew is working on at the moment. So that's probably your best way of doing that. And I will be putting that in the chat box, the link to the blog. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Carr and let him get started.
Thank you, Sherry and Beth. Today's presentation is by Dr. Brice Obermeyer, Director of the Delaware Tribe Historic Preservation Office. His office is located in Emporia, Kansas, and we're glad to have Bryce with us today. Bryce is an old friend of mine. I've known him for 20 years or more, and it's really is a pleasure to have him here. Bryce's work brings together the fields of Delaware archaeology, history, and ethnography on projects relevant to federal recognition, tribal historic preservation, and NAGPRA. He received his PhD from the University of Oklahoma, and he has written a book, The Delaware Tribe in a Cherokee Nation, along with many articles on the Delaware Tribe and their efforts to preserve their heritage. Delaware Historic Preservation Office also manages an office at East Stroudsburg University. Yes, and this is managed by an archaeologist, Susan Batchelor. And they also have an extension office in Duluth, Minnesota. These offices work together to protect and preserve Delaware historic and cultural sites in 17 states, from New Jersey to Oklahoma. And also they work with museums across the nation to repatriate ancestral remains removed from the same region. Our first workshop by Roger Moeller in early October covered the ancestors of the Delaware based on archaeology going back thousands of years. Our second presentation by Dr. Greg Latanzi was based on a combination of archaeology and history and offered a glimpse of how the Delaware changed in response to the European invasion, but also struggled to maintain their cultural traditions. Our presentation last week by Gene Sunderland used data from primary historic documents to discuss the Delaware interaction with the Dutch, Swedes, Finns, and English, and to illustrate how the Delaware wanted European goods, but were fiercely protective of their own personal, religious, and political sovereignty. The title of Bryce's presentation is Delaware Indians, Where Are They Now? Bryce will cover the movement of the Delaware people from the Delaware Valley across the Midwest to their current home in Oklahoma and their situation there today. As part of his presentation, the Delaware have been working with several groups in the Delaware Valley, such as the Tulpehocken Elementary School, and they developed a series of remarkably interesting maps illustrating the migration. In addition, he will report on the Abbott Farm National Historic Landmark Interpretive Plan. Abbott Farm is the name of a group of spectacular archaeological sites in the area around Trenton, New Jersey. These have been investigated for over 100 years and represent really a major contribution to the history of the Delaware people. Finally, he will report on a major repatriation project that focuses on the Abbott Farm complex, but includes Delaware remains from the entire Delaware Valley, including Pennsylvania. This involves the reburial of human remains and sacred objects at Pennsbury Manor. Pennsbury is the home of William Penn in Bucks County and will serve as a final centralized resting place for the Delaware people. So as you can see, the Delaware tribe is involved in many activities back here in Pennsylvania. So Bryce, why don't you get started?
Well, thank you, Kurt. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank the State Museum for hosting these talks and for inviting me to be a part of them. I also, as Kurt said, I'm presenting here from Kansas, and as such, I want to acknowledge that I'm giving this from ancestral lands of the Osage Nation, which incidentally will be part of a panel on repatriation at a conference next week. It's a great honor to be able to do this work. As Kurt mentioned, I'm the Historic Preservation Officer for the Delaware Tribe of Indians, one of 3 federally recognized Delaware tribes in the United States. And my talk today is going to bring together 2 projects, one that has been ongoing, as Kurt mentioned, for almost 20 years, and that's the repatriation of many ancestral Delaware remains from the Delaware Valley and the Susquehanna Valley to a final reburial place there at Pennsbury Manor. A large portion of these remains come from the Abbott Farm National Historic Landmark, as Kurt mentioned, in Trenton, New Jersey. And so this project, which began with that kind of 20-year, or my presentation, which we'll talk about that 20-year project, it also incorporates and begins with a project that we've just started last year with the Tulpehocken Nature Center and the Friends of the Abbott Marshlands on understanding, but also creating educational programming for elementary and high school age students on understanding the Lenape history in New Jersey, as well as the relocations outside of New Jersey. And so when we were developing this presentation, of course, I can't do 2 things at once. There we go. So I'd also like to acknowledge that much of the portions of this presentation were created with the support and in collaboration with the Friends of the Abbott Marshlands and the Tulpehocken Nature Center. And I should add that one of the reasons that brought us to working with the Nature Center and the Friends of the Abbott Marshlands was our work at repatriating Delaware remains from the Abbott marshlands for reburial at Pennsbury Manor. And in the process of developing this educational programming for the Tulpehawken Nature Center, it occurred to me that while the information about Lenape or Delaware removal is available in many different historical books, that it might be useful to kind of to set the stage for what our repatriation work is doing today. That it might be useful to begin with better understanding the Lenape migration or the Lenape diaspora, which is what we have been working on with the Friends and the Tulpehawken Nature Center. One of the points that came out of our work with the Nature Center and the Friends was that Delaware or Lenape removal was actually quite different than what the word removal often evokes for folks. And so with this slide here, I wanted to just kind of talk about the difference between removal and relocation, both of which may apply to Delaware migration or Lenape migration. But I think they evoke different images in the minds of students, in the minds of any student that's learning about the removal history of any tribe. Of course, the Delaware were not the only tribe that were removed. Many tribes were removed from their homelands, many of which are now in Oklahoma. But to separate these two, removal, the definition of removal is the action of taking away or abolishing something unwanted. This evokes a certain image, I think, when we use this word as one group being forced to leave by another group. And probably the clearest example of this in Native American history is the passage of the Indian Removal Act, in which President Jackson carried out the removal of the Cherokee who did not want to leave. And this, of course, brought about the Trail of Tears, a tragic chapter in Cherokee history, and one that many learn as students when we learn about Native American history. This is as a tragic example of both tribal resistance and tribal removal at the same tribal removal. The Trail of Tears is what's comes to mind when we use the word removal. However, the Delaware situation was very, very different than the Cherokee situation in many respects. The first of which is that the Delaware are one of very few tribes whose homeland included the eastern coast. And they're one of the few tribes that continue to be a federally recognized tribe. Of course, there's several others, but the removal of groups like the Delaware or the relocation of groups like the Delaware was often sporadic. It didn't happen in one forced movement of people. It wasn't a movement as a consequence of warfare. It wasn't a movement as a consequence of legislation that was passed that forced the people to move out. In fact, a lot of the removals or a lot of the movements of Delaware people, I would characterize, perhaps better characterized, as the action of moving to establish a new home. I think this evokes the image of a group moving with a certain degree of agency or choice, whereas removal, the choice was already made. It wasn't whether or not they were going to move or where they were going to move to. With removal, the choice was made for them. With relocation, there's a degree of choice where there's the potential to stay or there's the potential to leave, or that one has to leave, but where they go to is a matter of choice. And so relocation, I think, characterizes, for example, situations where the Lenape joined existing settlements or chose different groups of Lenape chose different places to move to. I think then thinking about Delaware history in terms of relocations albeit forced in many situations, had a greater degree of choice in them than when we when we use the word removal. That being said, there are situations in Lenape history where removal is a more appropriate description. I think other times, and many other times, relocation is more appropriate. I also want to add that at my last point here on the slide is that any move, whether it's removal or relocation, any move, or even when people choose to move, this is always carried out in response to external factors. There's always factors that are being considered when people moved. So I don't want to give the impression that relocation is somehow, a choice that people are freely making and, everyone's all excited about it. That's certainly not what I'm characterizing here. I'm saying that movements we can think of movements on sort of a spectrum where removal is the most, forced types of movements, and relocations have a greater and greater degree of choice with them. But movements are always made in response to external factors. And so to better understand Lenape movements, I think it's important to understand what these pressures were that caused people to move, or in some situations caused folks to choose to stay. The Delaware or Lenape, and I have just a brief summary of some major points about Lenape and Delaware origins and eventual relocation from their homelands. The Delaware or Lenape are a coastal Algonquin language stretching from Maine to Virginia. They're one language family that they're one language among a language family that stretches from Maine to Virginia. The Delaware are sort of in the middle of this larger coastal language family. The Lenape are two dialect groups, the Munsee in the north and the Unami in the south. And as you can see in the map there, the Delaware River is the center of the Delaware Homeland. Archaeological evidence indicates that Delaware-speaking peoples were moving into the Delaware River Valley by at least 500 BC or as late as 500 AD. The archaeological evidence doesn't show any conflict at this time, and so our best hypothesis for explaining this is that as Lenape people were moving into the Delaware Valley, they were joining resident populations. This was probably taking place over a series of generations where families would move in, join existing populations, and then in a chain migration, provide the foundation for new groups of Lenape to move into the Delaware Valley. And so for the next 2,000 years, the Delaware Homeland was centered in the Delaware Valley, and as Jean presented last week, it wasn't until the 17th century that pressure from the Dutch, the Swedes, and the English first to sell lands, and then later immigration further put pressure on additional lands from the Lenape, that these brought about new relocation pressures. But as Jean presented last week, it was never the case that the Delaware were, defeated militarily and forced to cede their territory, which is an image we kind of think of, a stereotyped image. As Jean presented, the Delaware controlled the Delaware Valley for much of the 17th century, and the exchanges that took place are I think more accurately characterized as relocation pressures. As more and more land was sold, as more and more primarily English settlers came to the colonies, it put greater pressures on Lenape land, and over time, those pressures were considerable enough for Lenape people to consider a new move. As a result, by the 18th century, Lenape people began moving out of the Delaware Valley. And with this map here, I want to illustrate the contrast here between the multiple removals of the Lenape, and although the Cherokee had more than one removal, the removal of Cherokee people happened on the Trail of Tears in one large mass removal to Oklahoma. Whereas with Lenape removal, the difference was that Lenape families, Lenape groups followed different Lenape leaders to new settlements, to new locations, first in places like the Susquehanna Valley and at the Stockbridge community in Massachusetts. And then as pressures from non-Indian settlers continued, those movements continued to move further west, but they were always movements that were joining the lands of other tribes, joining the settlements of other tribes, moving on to lands of other tribes, and establishing their own territories within these new lands. But the other thing I think is important about Lenape removal is that there wasn't one large tribal movement. It's better characterized as movements of leaders, movements of families that followed a particular leader. And that didn't necessarily mean that just because you moved with one leader one year that you couldn't then choose, well, I have relatives over here, so I'm going to move over here now. And so while my arrows on the map here seem to indicate, a series of smaller tribal movements, I simply couldn't create a map that would show the sophistication that would be needed to show how many times Lenape families and at what years Lenape families moved to different locations. Illustrating this, I think, complexity of Lenape removal, the result is in the United States, there are 4 federally recognized tribes that today are either recognized as descendant Delaware communities. The first 2, the Delaware Nation and the Delaware Tribe, being descendant Delaware tribes in Oklahoma. The Delaware Tribe, who I work for, is in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and the Delaware Nation is in western Oklahoma, in Anadarko. The Seneca Nation of Indians, while not recognized as a Delaware descended tribe, they do have a significant number of Delaware descendants that are now members of the Seneca Nation of Indians. And then the Stockbridge-Muncie community of Wisconsin and Bowler, Wisconsin, is a third descendant Delaware tribe. There's also 3 First Nations in Canada, the Delaware Nation in Moraviantown, the Muncie Delaware Nation, and the First Nations of the Grand River. These nations are all in Ontario, Canada. You can see them on the map. The Delaware Nation and the Muncie Delaware Nation are Delaware First Nations. The First Nations in the Grand River, the Delaware are one band among the First Nations of the Grand River. And so when thinking about or trying to conceptualize what Lenape migration was like, I think, again, it's very different than just one removal or one exodus or one diaspora. Rather, I think it's more appropriate to view this as families reacting or families responding to external factors that were, one, pushing families to choose to leave, pushing families to leave the Lenape homeland. And then at the same time, it's also important to recognize that there were factors that were pulling the Lenape to new homelands at the same time, that there was advantages to relocation, especially given the disadvantages that existed with not moving. So I'll start with the first pressure that that Lenape people were feeling and continued to feel. Now, this is another thing I should add, is that these weren't pressures that ended in Pennsylvania or the Delaware Valley. These are pressures that continued to follow Lenape groups as they moved even to new lands. And so the first is that in each situation, in each location, the Delawares always faced a degree of encroachment from non-Indians and theft from non-Indians. These are codified in documents as early as the Treaty of Crosswicks, and I would speculate, I imagine, much earlier, but for New Jersey, we have this quote about the land speculation in the Treaty of Crosswicks, in which some of our old men remember when the English were weak and the Indians were strong and many. Since our fathers have sold so large a part of their lands to the English, we find it difficult to maintain ourselves by hunt and families. I think that's important, that inclusion of families, to maintain ourselves and families by hunting, which is at least 1/2 of our support. And then also at the end, we think we still have some pieces of land for which we receive no compensation. I think going to Gene's talk last week about the sale of lands and that payment was expected on a yearly basis. And here we have, as late as 1756, Delaware leaders invoking those payments that were never continued or never made. But this didn't end in the Delaware Valleys. 100 years later, in the treaty with the Delaware, the last treaty, incidentally, that the Delawares signed in 1866 with the United States, you see in the language here that the Delawares were promised $30,000 for all claims for depredations on timber. And then also a large amount of stock has been stolen from the Delaware, and that the United States agrees to compensate for that loss of stock. The second factor that we're pushing Lenape people to leave was land speculation. I don't think this is emphasized enough, that oftentimes when treaties were negotiated or being negotiated, there were men in the background, non-Indian men in the background, that were purchasing or gaining title to the land that was being ceded. And the reason for this is they were land speculators. And this includes some of the most notable, everyone from William Penn's sons to George Washington speculated on Lenape treaties as they were being negotiated with Lenape people. You have the New Jersey, the Treaty of Easton, which ceded or confirmed the sale of lands in all of New Jersey, or much of New Jersey, and then the map here showing the different purchases and treaty agreements between the Delaware and other tribes for different portions of Pennsylvania, but in eastern Pennsylvania for the purchases and treaties with the Delaware. Of course, the most infamous is the walking purchase, which, as I mentioned, William Penn's sons fabricated a treaty that allowed for them to take that portion highlighted as the walking purchase, and then in order to sell the land to pay off their increasing debt. So there were financial pressures that were pushing the Delaware to leave. And this continued in every situation where the Delaware ceded land. Immediately after the land was ceded, the land was divided up and sold for a much higher value than it was paid for or traded for in the treaty. Then the final pressure that pushed Lenape people to leave was that Indian people, Lenape people in particular, lacked citizenship under British and American foreign policy. So to start with, number one, under British and American foreign policy, the British and the United States followed suit, treated tribes as sovereign independent nations, engaged tribes as sovereign independent nations, as they continue to be today. Tribes viewed themselves as separate governments from European nations. European nations viewed their sovereignty as separate from the sovereignty of tribes. As such, if Lenape people had to move if they wished to maintain Lenape citizenship, as opposed to becoming British subjects or American citizens. For a Lenape person, up until 1924, American Indians were not officially granted U.S. citizenship until 1924. This meant that relocation would maintain a person's tribal and family's tribal citizenship in one of the several Delaware tribes. And in every location where Lenape people once relocated, there are descendants of those who chose not to move. In instances where the descendants are organized, and in many situations they are, they lack federal acknowledgement, owing partially to this distinction, that by remaining behind, American citizenship had to be opted for as opposed to tribal citizenship. As an example, remaining in ceded lands relinquished tribal citizenship. We have a clear example of this in Kansas, where we have a list of 19 Delaware who elected to remain in Kansas rather than relocate to Indian Territory. As a result, they and their descendants became American citizens. Another attractive reason for moving, or a factor pulling people to move, was that the new lands were often obtained in many different ways in Indian territories. These were regions where other tribes, it was either the land of other tribes or it was land that was being guaranteed for tribes. And a little known, I think a part of American Indian history that needs to be taught more is that Indian territories, there were Indian territories. There wasn't just Indian territory in Oklahoma. Oklahoma was the last of several Indian territories that the United States had promised to tribes. And see, we have to remember what the word territory means. An Indian territory means that these were going to be territories that were destined for statehood. And we have this clearly articulated in the first treaty between the United States and an Indian tribe. It was the treaty with the Delaware in 1778. And in this treaty, you can see clearly at the bottom, which this was a treaty for lands in the state that would become Ohio, that in exchange for Delaware allegiance during the American Revolution, that the Delaware were promised that they could that Ohio would become a state and the Delaware nation would be the head of the state and have a representative in Congress. This idea of an Indian territory continued in places like Kansas, where tribes were relocated after the Indian Removal Act, and then finally, what is now the state of Oklahoma, the last Indian territory. And the tribes of Indian Territory, which is today Eastern Oklahoma, continued to push for statehood as the state of Sequoia until 1902. Another attractive factor was that in these new lands, there would be much less pressure to assimilate, and therefore the Lenape language and traditional cultural practices, traditional religious practices could continue without pressures, or without as many pressures to assimilate. That didn't, and so in new lands, Lenape people were free to choose to continue traditional cultural practices. They were also free to choose Christianity, or free to choose to adopt some elements of European lifeways or American lifeways, and not others. Some chose to traditional lifeways. Some chose Christianity and European lifeways. Most chose a combination of both. But the point is, in these new lands, there was greater freedom to be able to have those forms of expression. This was also further supported by the presence of other tribes who had moved for similar reasons, and would support the continuation of traditional cultural practices in these new lands. And then finally, I think it's also, I think sometimes living in the beautiful confines of the Delaware Valley, we forget the fact that the places where the Lenape moved to were equally as productive as the Delaware Valley. A quick look at the relocation map, and it doesn't take long to see that every time the Delaware moved, they always moved to fertile floodplains. And one of the things, as a historic preservation officer, I often visit these sites, and it's often remarkable how similar these locations look to the Delaware Valley. They're often wide floodplains, fertile floodplains, and with hills or bluffs on either side, confining the floodplains. Even in Oklahoma, there's the Osage Hills to the west of the Caney River Valley, and it looks as much like the Delaware Valley as any part of Oklahoma that I've ever seen. And so, the places that Delaware people were moving to were suitable for agriculture, and if they weren't, the Delaware would negotiate with the United States to move again. The best example of this is when the Delaware moved to southwest Missouri. They found a hilly country that was not suitable for agriculture. It flooded, the hunting wasn't good, and they approached the United States to ask for new lands, and they were able to secure the lands that would become the Delaware Reservation in Kansas, which is the southern border of which is the Kansas River and the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers, a very fertile region as well. Okay. So perhaps if we have time during the question period, we can go through this map. Part of our work with the Friends of the Abbott Marshlands and the Nature Center was to create an interactive relocation map that would that has the points of the current First Nations and federally recognized tribes, as well as the state recognized groups in New Jersey. And then we created layers so we can see the movement, so students can see the movement of people, movement of families at different times and different points. Of course, the applicability of this map, I think, is endless. It can be used for many different things. It's certainly not a perfect map. Like I said, because of the complexity of Lenape removals, but we've tried to, as best as possible, demonstrate for students the many removals, the many places throughout Eastern North America that Lenape people have moved. And there you can see, as Kurt mentioned, why our office manages historic sites and cemeteries in 17 different states.
All right, well, thank you. As you've been going along, we've had several questions that have already coming through. So we're gonna use the chat box, guys. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please use the chat box and we'll try and get those in. So the first question that came up goes way back to the beginning part of your program. Wondering why the Delaware stopped in their original settlement at the end of Delaware. Why didn't they go past present day Delaware?
Oh, the homeland?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it does look like it's a rather abrupt stop. The difference was the difference between the Susquehanna and the Delaware River Valley, is my understanding, is that the Susquehanna forms the Chesapeake Bay and the Delaware, or empties into the Chesapeake and the Delaware into the Delaware Bay, and the Susquehanna River was the territory of the Susquehanna, and so that's where the borders fell.
So with the walking purchase, one of the persons brought up that was a great example of encroachment. Did we see a spike in any sort of movement of the people after the walking purchase?
Yes, but the people moved before, and they certainly moved after. I think the walking purchase, another interesting element here is the walking purchase happened before New Jersey was sold. So just because people on the western side of the Delaware Valley may have moved, they could have also moved east into lands that were still Delaware lands in New Jersey. So it wasn't, so these movements, that's why characterizing these movements is difficult, because Lenape people were always moving, and so there was an increase in Lenape settlements in western settlements after 1737.
So a question coming up, this is sort of a modern day question. There are several Lenape people, particularly in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, that consider themselves Lenape, but they're not recognized by the federal. How have your groups considered them? What do they think about that?
Well, I think the view taken by the tribal governments is one that's complicated by federal Indian law, and so there's certain things. There's certain, for instance, NAGPRA. I'll use NAGPRA as an example. NAGPRA is a federal law, stands for Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and it's that federal law that enables tribes to take back ancestral remains and ancestral remains from museums and federal agencies. That law, however, only applies to federally recognized tribes. And so often, I think on the one hand, you may have situations where the federally recognized tribes are not participating not participating with state recognized tribes, and then there's other situations where they are. So I think as a blanket statement, I think blanket statements have been made. I know they've been made, but I think there's also a lot more flexibility in that, depending on the situation.
All right. So someone's had an interest about your map. Is it available? How is it available?
Oh, the digital map. One way it's available. It is a map that we developed with support with the Friends, and the Friends it's their map, to be quite frank. And so we would have, one way to have access to it would be to take one of their educational programs and participate that way. The programs we are originally created for elementary age students, but the idea is they can be expanded for any age group, you know, any student, any age that wants to learn more about Lenape history. And, you know, we've also thought about the possibility of, you know, using these in terms of historic preservation work. And so, so they, but we haven't gotten that far. It's still, the map still isn't actually, it's still in its prototype format. We haven't actually issued the final program.
Yeah.
In fact, actually right now, the map has been shared with, or an opportunity to review the map and the programs has been shared with the First Nations, the federally recognized tribes, as well as the state recognized groups in New Jersey, because this is a program in New Jersey, for an opportunity to comment and provide any feedback on the map.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So this is an interesting question. So telling the Lenape migration story, do you worry that someone could distort your message to say Indian removal wasn't that bad?
Yeah, and so great point, and I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to say this. And that's why on my slide at the beginning, I didn't want, I wanted to show that it is that bad, you know. Theft is bad. If you're being murdered because of your ethnicity, that's bad. You know, that's terrible. So that's bad. However, that can also be conceptualized as a pressure. And so some may choose, and so at some point, how do you escape those kind of pressures? I think moving is one of those ways of escaping. Other ways might be assimilating. Other ways might be joining with other groups in some way. So I think a different way to think about it is that the pressures were horrific. You know, the pressures were tragic. The pressures were horrific. How people responded to them, though, wasn't predetermined. And so the people, their families, their leaders had a degree of choice in how they responded to those horrific pressures, is how I would characterize it.
Yeah, it is interesting. Oh, this is an interesting one. This is from a nature perspective. So yes, you mentioned how the people moving tried to pick similar landscapes, but how did they deal with the differences of flora and fauna in these new locations?
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I haven't seen anything in the historical records that indicate that it was a challenge. It is interesting that Lenape, the language, which, you know, continued late into the 20th century, early 21st century, it retained words for flora and fauna that weren't found in Oklahoma, but were found in, you know, the Delaware River. Interestingly, there was even words for earlier, you know, words for flora and fauna that were from further north, north of the Delaware Valley, so that, you know, the words of the Delaware Valley that reflected the flora and fauna of the Delaware Valley continued with Delaware people as they learned and adopted to new environments. I think an important element that probably, and I haven't seen anything where Delaware people are, you know, challenged by new flora and fauna, and I wonder if part of that reason is that as Delaware people moved, they typically would move to lands that were occupied by allied tribes, allied groups, and probably even had already intermarried with groups as well. And so there was a degree of familiarity that would come from already knowing where one is moving. or knowing
So,
the people where you're moving.
yeah. Well, I had one question about the Lenape in Oklahoma, but of course you're the Lenape in Kansas. But how
Well, no,
much you
my
work with them
office
too?
is in Kansas, but I work for the Delaware tribe in Oklahoma.
Okay. Well, this may be a two-part question. So the differences between those two groups, and how much have you been working towards keeping your East Coast history alive, is the question.
Well, I did have a slide that I would love to share to help answer that question. One of the ways that we work in the East Coast is in the work of repatriation, which I think is, connects well with a talk about relocation, because here repatriation is bringing or returning back to one's country of origin. And that's much of the work that we do in tribal historic preservation. And as Kurt mentioned, what we are doing is repatriating remains from the Delaware Valley for reinterment at Pennsbury, but this is work that has been ongoing throughout the eastern United States. Here's a map that we use that shows our tribal population by county, and some of the projects that we've done. We have a reburial site in Ohio, as well as one at Ellis Island in New York. The repatriation that we're doing at Pennsbury includes many different sites from the Susquehanna and Delaware Valley. And I think even more important is that not only is our office involved, but we have tribal members and volunteers that are involved in the work that goes into repatriation and reburial. Last year, in preparation for the burial at Pennsbury Manor, the Delaware tribe, with funding from the Cultural Resources Group, did the historic preservation work, did the mitigation at Pennsbury Manor, because of course Pennsbury Manor is a historic site along the Delaware River. And so before we did a burial there, we wanted to make sure we weren't impacting any existing historical resources. And so Susan Bacher led the team, the survey team, which included two students, two tribal members that are interested in pursuing careers in archaeology, as well as volunteers, local archaeological volunteers to help with the work. And so I think in that way, I think that's a good illustration of the way how, while removed, the work that we continue to do is work that bring ancestral remains that have been removed, and removed is being used in the appropriate context there. Ancestral remains that have been removed from the Delaware Valley, and repatriating them and returning them or relocating them to the Delaware Valley.
Well, that goes actually nicely into the next question, which was asking about Pennsbury Manor. One of the questions was, and I'll answer this one, unfortunately, Pennsbury Manor, we are not open for the public right now because of the COVID situation. Not quite sure. There is no date that the state is issuing on when we're going to be opening up our site, so we'll just kind of leave it at that. But if they were with the site open, is this something they could visit? Is it marked at the site, or is it kind of quite private, like where you're doing this?
Well, the reburial ceremony will be private. It will have representatives from the three tribes carry out the ceremony, and it'll be a closed event. But afterwards, if you've ever been to Pennsbury Manor, the reburial is going to take place in the field that, as you enter Pennsbury Manor, it's the long fence as you come into the property, and it's located on the other side of that fence in the field, and it'll be marked, and you're welcome to visit the you're welcome to visit the cemetery. Visiting the cemetery will be open to the public, but it won't be an interpretive site, so to speak, but it will be part of, it will be part of the Pennsbury Manor grounds.
Nice. So how, let's see. So as the Lenape have moved into Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, was there much intertribal warfare when they went west of Mississippi?
There were. It wasn't. There were more skirmishes, and I think of examples. There were skirmishes between the Delaware and the Osage. There were skirmishes between the Delaware and the Pawnee that are recorded west of the Mississippi River. I'm not aware of any. And then again, there was also skirmishes where the Delaware served as scouts for the American military expeditions. For instance, in the Mexican-American War, the Delaware served in the Mexican-American War. So there was certainly warfare. The outright warfare was American-led, and Delaware people were a part of it. But I would say the intertribal battles were more skirmishes between groups. Incidentally, for the Osage, as a reconciliation to those earlier conflicts, when the Delawares were moved to Indian Territory, the Delaware and the Osage were again neighbors, and they hosted smokes, annual get-togethers that were a form of reconciliation and mending those relationships. And today, I think the Delaware and the Osage have a fairly close relationship. To add about warfare, another little known fact is that the Delaware fought for the Union in the Civil War. And so the Delaware have been American allies for quite some time and have a very long history of dedicated military service to the United States.
All right, so we're coming to the end. Just a little bit, anybody have any last minute questions, get them up, but I love this question. So I am 7, I'm gonna read this for you. His name is Wyatt. I am 7 and I wanna know how much school you did to be where you are, and what school did you go to? Oh, Mabel is her name, sorry.
Well, hi, first of all, I'm so glad that you're here, and hopefully you're not missing school to be part of this. My kids are actually up right now. I think they're on lunch break, so maybe you're able to catch this over lunch, and I'm so excited that you're able to do that. It might sound like a lot of school right now if you're 7, and I see your brother is 10. It might seem like a lot of school, but to get your PhD in my education is in anthropology, and I have a PhD in anthropology. Of course, you'll have to graduate high school and then go to college. And then after college, which usually takes about 4 to 5 years, you have to enter a graduate program. And that graduate program can take sometimes 7 or 8 years, depending on the length of your research study. But so if you add all that up, that means you would go to school till you're in your late 20s. And I know that sounds like an awful long time right now, but if you think about it, if you think of it like it's something that you want to do and that you enjoy doing, think of it like you're not going to be done when you're 28. You're going to be doing it like I do it for the rest of your life. So if this is something you're interested in, I would recommend that. I would definitely recommend it.
Looks like Sherry somehow went on mute. This is Jenny. Hold on one second. I'll see if I can get her off. But I think the questions are tapering off here. I see we had a 3rd grade teacher who watched it too. All of these presentations will be on YouTube, and Sherry will share that link next week sometime. Bryce, again, thank you. We appreciate your time.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, one last thing. I'm going to be putting in the chat box before everybody heads out 3 different links that you might be interested in. One, of course, is back to our Pennsylvania Heritage society, keeping this going is our donations. So, add to those donations. Also, we were talking about in the beginning, Dr. Carr's blog site to learn about what his crew is up to. There's a link to that. And lastly, Dr. Obermeyer shared an article that if anybody's interested in exploring more of the projects he's been up to, there's a link to that as well.